Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, England, November 24th, 1942. The fluorescent lights hummed in Hut 6 as a young cryptanalyst named Margaret lifted her pencil from the decrypted Luftwaffe message, reading it a second time to be certain she hadn't made an error. The message was clear. Adolf Hitler had personally ordered the Sixth Army to hold Stalingrad at all costs. No breakout, no retreat. The largest German army on the Eastern Front, now surrounded by Soviet forces, was to stand and fight where it stood. She walked the decrypt to her supervisor, who read it, then looked up at her with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Not surprise, exactly. Something closer to recognition, as if he'd been waiting for Hitler to make precisely this kind of mistake. "Get this to London immediately," he said. "Churchill will want to see it within the hour." 3 days earlier, Soviet forces had launched Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement that swept around Stalingrad from north and south, cutting through the Romanian armies protecting the German flanks. The two Soviet pincers had met at Kalach on the Don, trapping General Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army and elements of the 4th Panzer Army inside a pocket roughly 30 miles wide and 20 miles deep. Nearly 300,000 German and Axis troops were now encircled in the ruins of Stalingrad and the frozen steppe around it. British intelligence had been tracking the build-up to this moment for weeks. The decrypt traffic flowing through Bletchley Park had shown Soviet reinforcements massing north and south of the city. German intelligence reports, intercepted and decoded, revealed that the Wehrmacht knew something was coming but had catastrophically underestimated the scale and timing of the Soviet offensive. Now, as November gave way to the brutal cold of a Russian winter, British military analysts in London were reading the same German communications that were flowing to Hitler's headquarters. They could see the situation with the same clarity as the German High Command. They could read the desperate requests from Paulus for permission to break out. They could read the Luftwaffe's assessments of what would be required to supply an encircled army by air. They could read Hitler's responses, and what they read told them something profound about how Germany would lose this war. In the War Office on Whitehall, Major General John Kennedy, Director of Military Operations, spread a map of southern Russia across his desk. Red pencil marks showed the Soviet encirclement. Blue marks showed the trapped German forces. Black marks indicated the nearest German relief forces, over 100 miles away, across frozen steppe. Kennedy had spent the morning reviewing intelligence summaries. The numbers were stark. The Sixth Army needed a minimum of 300 tons of supplies per day to maintain combat effectiveness. Food, ammunition, fuel, medical, supplies, winter clothing. The Luftwaffe would have to fly these supplies into primitive airfields within the pocket, through deteriorating weather, against increasingly effective Soviet air defenses. He did the arithmetic. 300 tons per day. The Junkers. 52 transport, Germany's workhorse cargo aircraft, could carry about 2.5 tons under ideal conditions. That meant at least 120 flights per day, every single day, in winter weather, through Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Kennedy had fought in the First World War. He understood logistics. He understood what happened to armies that ran out of food and ammunition. He picked up his telephone and asked to be connected to the Chief of the Imperial General Staff. "Alan," he said when General Sir Alan Brooke answered, "you need to see the latest intelligence from Stalingrad. Hitler's ordered them to hold in place, no breakout. He's promising them an airlift." There was a pause on the line. Then Brooke's voice, dry and precise. "An airlift, in Russian winter, for an entire army." "Yes, sir." Then he's lost them already. He just doesn't know it yet. But knowing it and watching it unfold were different things. Over the following days and weeks, British intelligence officers at Bletchley Park decrypted hundreds of German messages flowing to and from the Stalingrad pocket. They read the Luftwaffe's increasingly desperate attempts to organize the airlift. They read the reports of transport aircraft shot down, of airfields overrun by Soviet advances, of supplies dropped in the wrong locations or destroyed on the ground. The decrypt traffic painted a picture of an army dying by degrees. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had personally promised Hitler that his aircraft could deliver 500 tons per day to the pocket. The British intercepted his assurances. They also intercepted the responses from Luftwaffe officers in the field, who knew the promise was impossible, but couldn't say so directly to their Führer. Flight Lieutenant Robert Patterson, an intelligence officer attached to RAF Bomber Command, spent his days analyzing the German airlift operations. Before the war, he'd been an accountant. Now he applied the same methodical thinking to counting German transport aircraft, calculating flight times, estimating payload capacities. His reports made grim reading. The Germans had begun the airlift with around 500 Junkers, 52 transports available for the Stalingrad operation. But these aircraft were scattered across multiple airfields, many of them primitive strips carved out of frozen mud. The weather in late November and December was deteriorating rapidly. Snowstorms, fog, temperatures dropping to 20 below zero and colder. Patterson calculated that under optimal conditions, with every available aircraft flying multiple sorties per day, the Luftwaffe might manage to deliver 200 tons daily. Maybe. That was 2/3 short of what the Sixth Army needed just to survive, let alone fight, and conditions were anything but optimal. British intelligence tracked the Soviet response to the airlift. Red Army fighters were concentrating around the known flight paths into the pocket. Anti-aircraft batteries were being repositioned to cover the German airfields. Soviet mobile forces were pushing toward the airstrips inside the pocket itself, forcing the Germans to abandon fields and consolidate into fewer, more crowded, more vulnerable locations. The decrypt traffic showed German transport pilots reporting increasingly desperate conditions. Aircraft damaged by ground fire, limping back to base. Crews forced to fly in weather that would normally ground all operations. Supplies piled up at departure airfields because there weren't enough serviceable aircraft to carry them. In London, Churchill received daily intelligence summaries on Stalingrad. The Prime Minister understood the significance of what was unfolding. For 2 years, the Soviet Union had borne the overwhelming weight of fighting Germany on land. Britain's contribution to the land war had been limited to North Africa and small-scale raids. The Americans had only just entered the fighting in North Africa, but here, in the frozen ruins of a city on the Volga, the Wehrmacht was being bled white. Churchill dictated a minute to his chiefs of staff. The Russian performance has exceeded all expectations. If they can destroy the Sixth Army, it will mark a turning point in the war. We must consider how this affects our own strategic planning. What the British saw in the intelligence traffic was more than just a military disaster unfolding. They saw a pattern in Hitler's decision-making that would, they hoped, be repeated. Hitler had forbidden retreat. He had staked German prestige on holding Stalingrad. He had promised an airlift that couldn't work. And he had ignored the advice of his own military commanders, who understood the situation on the ground. General Brooke wrote in his diary, in an entry that would be preserved in archives, "Hitler is making the same mistake Napoleon made. He's allowing political considerations to override military necessity. An army surrounded is an army that should break out immediately or surrender. Every day they remain trapped, they grow weaker. He's feeding them into a meat grinder, one transport aircraft at a time." The British military establishment had spent years studying German military doctrine. They had enormous respect for the German general staff, for the professionalism of Wehrmacht officers, for the tactical skill of German commanders. But they were beginning to understand that Hitler himself was becoming Germany's greatest vulnerability. A dictator who refused to allow retreat, who made strategic decisions based on ideology rather than military reality, who promised miracles that violated basic arithmetic. In the Joint Intelligence Committee, analysts, prepared assessments of what Stalingrad meant for the broader war. If Germany lost the Sixth Army, they would lose not just 300,000 men, but also the offensive capability in southern Russia. The oil fields of the Caucasus, which had been one of Germany's primary objectives in the 1942 summer offensive, would remain out of reach. The initiative on the Eastern Front would pass to the Soviets. One assessment, circulated to the War Cabinet in early December, noted, "The Führer's insistence on holding Stalingrad at all costs demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of modern mobile warfare. An encircled force that cannot be adequately supplied becomes a wasting asset. The longer it holds, the weaker it becomes until it can no longer affect the outcome of the battle. The rational decision would be to authorize an immediate breakout attempt, while the Sixth Army retains the strength to fight its way out. That Hitler has forbidden this suggests he is making decisions based on political and psychological factors rather than military logic." The assessment was clinical, analytical, the product of professional military minds examining an enemy's mistake. But underlying the dry language was something else. Hope. The hope that Hitler would continue making these kinds of mistakes, that his need for symbolic victories would override sound strategy, that his refusal to accept reality would lead him to squander Germany's military strength in futile gestures. By mid-December, the decrypted traffic from Stalingrad had become a chronicle of slow-motion catastrophe. The Luftwaffe was losing transport aircraft at an unsustainable rate. Soviet fighters were shooting down Junkers 52s faster than German factories could replace them. The airlift was delivering, on average, less than 100 tons per day. Some days, in bad weather, almost nothing got through. Inside the pocket, the Sixth Army was consuming its own substance. Horses were being slaughtered for food. Fuel was being rationed so severely that tanks couldn't move. Ammunition stocks were declining. The wounded were dying because there were no medical supplies to treat them and no aircraft to evacuate them. British intelligence officers read the German situation reports with a mixture of professional interest and human sympathy. These were, after all, reports of men freezing and starving. But they were also reports of an enemy army being destroyed, and that destruction was happening because of decisions made at the highest levels of German leadership. Wing Commander Winterbotham, who oversaw the distribution of ultra-intelligence to British commanders, later wrote about this period. "We could read the German messages almost as quickly as Hitler could. We knew what Paulus was requesting, we knew what Hitler was ordering, we knew what the Luftwaffe was actually delivering, and we knew that the mathematics didn't work. The Sixth Army was doomed, and Hitler had doomed it by refusing to acknowledge reality." On December 16th, the Germans launched Operation Winter Storm, a relief operation intended to break through to Stalingrad and open a corridor for supplies. British intelligence tracked the German forces involved. General Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, attacking from the southwest, made initial progress against Soviet defenses. For a few days, the situation looked uncertain. The German relief force pushed to within 30 miles of the pocket. If they could break through, if they could establish a supply corridor, the Sixth Army might survive. But Hitler's orders remained unchanged. The Sixth Army was to hold its positions. It was not to break out to meet the relief force. Paulus was to wait to be rescued. British analysts watching this unfold understood what it meant. A breakout toward the relief force would require the Sixth Army to abandon Stalingrad, to give up the positions it had fought all autumn to capture. Hitler would not permit this. The city's symbolic value, the fact that it bore Stalin's name, made retreat psychologically impossible for the German leader. So the Sixth Army stayed in place, growing weaker by the day, while Hoth's panzers fought to reach them, and the Soviets, reading the German intentions, shifted forces to block the relief attempt. By December 23rd, Winter Storm had failed. The relief force was pushed back. The gap between Hoth's spearhead and the Stalingrad pocket widened again. The window for breakout, if it had ever truly existed, was closing. Major General Kennedy, reviewing the intelligence summaries in London, wrote a memo that captured British thinking. The Germans have demonstrated extraordinary tactical skill in their relief operation, but strategic paralysis at the command level. Hitler's refusal to authorize a breakout has condemned the Sixth Army to destruction. A competent commander would recognize that the symbolic value of holding Stalingrad is far less than the practical value of preserving a field army. But Hitler appears incapable of making this calculation. As Christmas approached, the decrypt traffic from Stalingrad took on an increasingly desperate tone. German commanders inside the pocket were reporting that their men were on starvation rations. 1,200 calories per day, then 1,000, then less. Frostbite casualties were overwhelming the medical services. Typhus was spreading in the crowded bunkers and cellars where troops sheltered from Soviet artillery in the savage cold. The Luftwaffe's airlift operations were collapsing. Soviet forces had overrun several of the airfields inside the pocket, forcing all supply flights to concentrate on a single field at Pitomnik. The runway there was under constant Soviet artillery fire. Transport aircraft were being destroyed on the ground. Pilots were refusing to fly in weather that made navigation nearly impossible, and survival rates even worse. British intelligence officers at Bletchley Park worked in shifts around the clock, processing the flood of German communications. They were reading the Wehrmacht's private anguish, messages from commanders pleading for permission to break out, messages from supply officers reporting that there was no food left to distribute, messages from medical officers describing conditions that violated every principle of military medicine, and they were reading Hitler's responses, orders to hold fast, promises that relief was coming, assurances that the Luftwaffe would increase deliveries, declarations that Stalingrad must be held for the sake of German prestige and morale. Flight Lieutenant Patterson, the former accountant turned intelligence analyst, prepared a detailed assessment of the airlift's failure. His report included tables showing required supply tonnages versus actual deliveries, graphs showing the declining number of serviceable transport aircraft, calculations demonstrating that even if weather and Soviet opposition improved dramatically, the airlift could never meet the Sixth Army's needs. His conclusion was stark. The Stalingrad airlift has failed. It was probably doomed from the start, but any remaining hope ended when Soviet forces overran the outlying airfields and concentrated anti-aircraft defenses around Pitomnik. The Sixth Army cannot be supplied by air. It cannot break out without authorization. It cannot be relieved by external forces. Therefore, it will be destroyed. The only question is whether this happens through surrender or through fighting to the last man. That decision rests with Hitler. The report was circulated to the chiefs of staff and to Churchill. The Prime Minister read it and reportedly said to his private secretary, "Hitler is doing our work for us. He's destroying his own army through sheer obstinacy. We must pray he continues to make such decisions." It was a cold calculation, the kind of calculation that wars demand. British leaders were watching hundreds of thousands of men suffer and die, and they were hoping that suffering would continue because it served British strategic interests. There was no pleasure in it, but there was recognition of its value. In early January 1943, Soviet forces launched Operation Ring, the final offensive to destroy the Stalingrad pocket. They attacked from multiple directions, systematically crushing the perimeter inward. The Germans fought with desperate skill, but they were weak from hunger and cold, short on ammunition, unable to maneuver because they had no fuel. British intelligence tracked the Soviet advance through the decrypt traffic. German situation reports described defensive lines collapsing, units being overrun, the pocket fragmenting into isolated strong points. The Luftwaffe abandoned Pitomnik airfield on January 16th. Supply flights shifted to the smaller field at Gumrak, but that too was under Soviet fire. By January 22nd, Gumrak was lost. the last German-held airfield inside the pocket was gone. Now there was no possibility of supply, no possibility of evacuation, no possibility of anything except surrender or death. The decrypt traffic showed Paulus requesting permission to surrender. Hitler's response was to promote him to field marshal and remind him that no German field marshal had ever surrendered. The implication was clear. Paulus was expected to fight to the death or commit suicide. British analysts reading these exchanges saw them as confirmation of everything they'd concluded about Hitler's leadership. He would sacrifice an entire army rather than accept the reality of defeat. He would doom hundreds of thousands of men rather than make the rational military decision to cut losses and preserve forces for future operations. General Brooke wrote in his diary, "Hitler has now made Paulus a field marshal, apparently in the expectation that this will compel him to commit suicide rather than surrender. This is madness masquerading as leadership. A rational commander preserves his forces when they can no longer achieve their objective. Hitler appears to believe that symbolic gestures can substitute for military reality." On February 2, 1943, the last German forces in Stalingrad surrendered. Field Marshal Paulus, despite Hitler's expectations, chose to live and enter Soviet captivity. Of the nearly 300,000 German and Axis troops encircled in November, fewer than 6,000 would eventually return home from Soviet prison camps. The British response to the news was measured in public, triumphant in private. Churchill gave a speech noting the Soviet victory and its significance for the war. In the War Cabinet, the discussion was more frank. The minutes of the War Cabinet meeting on February 3rd recorded. The Prime Minister observed that the destruction of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad represented the greatest German defeat of the war to date. More significantly, it demonstrated a pattern in German strategic decision-making that could be exploited. The Führer's refusal to authorize tactical retreats, his insistence on holding positions for symbolic rather than military reasons, and his tendency to make promises that exceeded practical capabilities all suggested vulnerabilities in German command structure. General Brooke was more direct in his private diary. "Hitler has proven himself to be Germany's greatest liability. His generals understand warfare. He understands propaganda. When the two conflict, he chooses propaganda. At Stalingrad, he chose the symbolic value of holding a city over the practical value of preserving an army. If he continues making such choices, we will win this war, regardless of German tactical superiority." In the months and years that followed, British intelligence would see Hitler repeat this pattern. At Kursk, where he launched a massive offensive despite his generals' reservations and lost. In Normandy, where he refused to allow mobile defense and insisted on holding every inch of ground. In the Ardennes, where he gambled everything on a winter offensive that had no realistic chance of success. Each time, British commanders would remember Stalingrad. They would remember watching through decrypted messages as Hitler condemned an entire army to destruction rather than authorize a retreat. They would remember seeing a dictator's need for symbolic victories override military necessity. The young cryptanalyst Margaret, who had processed that first decrypt about Hitler's stand-fast order back in November, would work at Bletchley Park for the rest of the war. She would decrypt thousands more German messages. But she would always remember that particular message and the expression on her supervisor's face when he read it. Years later, in an oral history interview, she would say, "We knew immediately what it meant, not just for those poor men in Stalingrad, but for the whole war." Hitler had made a choice that revealed everything about how he thought. He valued symbols over soldiers. He believed willpower could overcome logistics. He couldn't accept reality when reality contradicted his plans. And we knew that if he'd made that choice once, he'd make it again. In a strange way, that decrypt was one of the most important pieces of intelligence we ever processed. Not because it told us what was happening at Stalingrad, We already knew that, but because it told us who Hitler really was and how he would continue to make decisions. It gave us hope that Germany would defeat itself, one refused retreat at a time. In the British military establishment, Stalingrad became a case study. Staff officers analyzed Hitler's decision-making process. Intelligence analysts developed profiles of how he responded to setbacks. Planners incorporated assumptions about German inflexibility into their operational designs. The lesson was clear. Germany had superb generals, excellent troops, and sophisticated doctrine, but it had a leader who would rather destroy his own armies than admit defeat. And that, British commanders concluded, was a vulnerability they could exploit. When British forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, they did so with the knowledge that Hitler would likely refuse to allow German forces to conduct mobile defense. When they broke out from the beachhead, they expected Hitler to order counterattacks rather than strategic withdrawal. When they pushed into Germany itself, they anticipated that Hitler would insist on defending every town and city rather than preserving forces for coherent defense. They were right on all counts. The pattern that first became clear at Stalingrad repeated itself across every theater of the war. Hitler's refusal to retreat, his insistence on holding ground regardless of cost, his belief that willpower could overcome material reality. These characteristics, which might have seemed like strength or determination, were actually strategic weaknesses that British planners learned to anticipate and exploit. In the end, what British High Command said when they saw Hitler refuse to retreat at Stalingrad wasn't a single dramatic quote. It was a series of sober, analytical assessments that reached a common conclusion. Hitler was making decisions that would lose Germany the war. He was doing so for psychological and ideological reasons that overrode military logic. And if British strategy could force him into situations where he would repeat these kinds of decisions, the Allies would win. Stalingrad was where they saw the pattern clearly for the first time. The decrypt traffic flowing through Bletchley Park had given them a window into Hitler's mind at a critical moment. They had watched him choose symbolism over strategy, propaganda over practicality, ideological rigidity over tactical flexibility. And they had recognized that this was how Germany would lose. Not through lack of courage or skill or determination, but through a failure of leadership at the very top. Through a dictator who couldn't accept reality, who couldn't admit mistakes, who couldn't authorize retreat, even when retreat was the only rational option. The Sixth Army died at Stalingrad because Hitler refused to let it leave. British commanders, reading the intelligence in London, understood that this decision revealed more about Germany's vulnerabilities than a dozen battlefield victories could have shown them. They saw a pattern that would repeat, and they planned accordingly. In the cold arithmetic of war, Hitler's refusal to retreat at Stalingrad was a gift to the Allied cause. It destroyed a German army. It shifted the initiative on the Eastern Front. And it demonstrated a pattern of decision-making that British strategists would exploit for the rest of the war. The men at Bletchley Park who decrypted those messages, the analysts who assessed their implications, the commanders who incorporated those assessments into strategy, all understood what they were seeing. They were watching Germany defeat itself, one refused retreat at a time, and they were learning how to ensure that pattern continued until the war was won.